In the late Middle Ages, second half of the Middle Ages, vernacular Bibles were coming into their own language. Instead of the Latin Bible, Bibles in the language of the people. And that was true in England as well as other countries. And in England, it was John Wycliffe and his disciples who were responsible for the very first English Bible, and that was produced in the 1380s. It was a translation into English from the Latin rather than the Greek and the Hebrew, but that usually is the one that has the distinction of being the first. During the time of the Reformation, there was a lot of English Bible translation, different versions that were available that reflected some of the religious trends of the time. But by the middle of the 17th century, the King James Version had become the standard Bible, and it remained such until the middle of the 20th century. But what happened with respect to the King James Version was a realization of at least two things. First, the English language had changed, and so there was a sense that if the Bible was going to communicate clearly, it needed to be in more modern English. And secondly, there was more evidence available as to what constituted the original Greek and Hebrew from which you ought to translate in the first place. Then beyond that, you had disagreements among the scholarly world as to what was the best way to translate, what kind of English to use. There were also theological issues about whether you ought to understand the Old Testament by means of the New, for example, or whether it should be translated independently of how it's used in the New Testament. So you had theological issues, you had language issues, you had textual issues that I think are responsible for the proliferation of English Bibles over the last 50 years, let's say. The English Standard Version is the most recent representative of a family of English Bibles that sometimes are called the Great Tradition of English Bibles. And these are translations that are related to one another, mostly in the form of vocabulary and syntax that go all the way back into the 16th century, beginning with William Tyndale, and proceeding through 16th century versions like Coverdale, Geneva Bible, the 17th century King James Bible, then into the 19th century, the Revised Version, American Standard Version, 20th century, the Revised Standard Version, and now, in our times, the English Standard Version. So they all are related to one another and present themselves as revisions of earlier translations in that same basic family of English Bibles, the Great Tradition. It certainly wasn't the only option. There are lots of Bibles out there. And in Lutheran worship, approximately the generation prior to Lutheran Service Book, the New International Version had been the one that was in use, largely in use in our circles, though never exclusively. So in theory, one could have stayed with the New International Version, or could have chosen something like the Contemporary English Bible, or God's Word, or the version that's sometimes called the Beck Bible. So there are a lot of different options. But the English Standard Version was an effort by our synod to move back to the Great Tradition. Many people in the Missouri Synod grew up with either the King James Version or the Revised Standard Version. And so they have a sense of what the Bible should sound like. The New International Version didn't sound like the Great Tradition. The English Standard Version does. And so I think that was a part of the reason, at least, why they went back to the Great Tradition. Well, I'd probably want to ask that person a few questions as to what does he have in mind for this particular translation. If it's a pastor who's thinking about using a Bible in church, I'd say, well, use the English Standard Version because that's the one that's in the hymnal. I might even say that to a layman who's interested in a Bible at home. There's not a lot of reason to choose a translation that's different from the one that's going to be used in your church service. On the other hand, if I were talking to somebody who needed, I thought, kind of an easier, or wanted just an easier language translation, then I might suggest something like the Beck Bible, which was done originally to reflect an American vernacular so that it would be easy for people to read who didn't have a great background in English literature or the like. I might also say if somebody who's interested from a literary standpoint, they might want to use the King James Version. So there are a lot of choices out there, and I think the answer depends a little bit on what you want to do with the Bible.